Alrighty, fit folk, in today's video we're going through the 5 best foods for weight loss. These are 5 filling food groups that evidence tells us are very good at helping us stay full in a deficit, which is the key to weight loss. We're going to go through them one at a time. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first of our filling food groups is lean protein. We know that protein is the most filling macronutrient. We know that it has the highest thermic effect, so it costs a lot of energy to digest. And we know that it can help protect muscle mass and metabolism as we diet down. So it's an absolute no-brainer when it comes to dieting to increase your protein intake. They did a study a few years ago. What they did was make one change. They changed from 15% protein in terms of energy to 30% in the diet. And people spontaneously reduced their energy consumption by about 450 calories, and over the course of 12 weeks, they lost 6 kilos. So that is one simple change. Eating more protein, it gets a little bit expensive, is probably the only major downside, and maybe long term, like over decades, you wouldn't want to have really high protein intake. But when you're dieting, it's an absolute no-brainer to increase your protein intake. The second of our filling food groups is colorful veggies. These are veggies that specifically have low caloric density. That is, they've got a lot of volume for a limited amount of calories. And what this does, all the water and fiber and just space that they take up, stretches the stomach. It creates a stretch reflex in the stomach, which sends a hormonal signal to the brain telling us that we're full. So these are definitely our friends. And not only this, they are the staple of all the longest lived societies on earth because they're completely full of micronutrients, which are wonderful for health and longevity in general. So these foods that are very low in caloric density, there's a whole diet plan named after them called volumetrics, and they can be super useful when you're trying to stay full while eating limited calories. So they are an absolute sensational idea to eat more of these foods when you are dieting down. The third of our filling food groups is natural fats. We need some fat in our diet to help absorb micronutrients and also just generally to protect hormonal health. But we've learned in recent years that fat can actually be quite helpful in keeping us full, and thankfully the days of demonizing fat in general are behind us. But fat can still be a massive part of overeating if we're not careful, and the simplest way to think about the fats that are more useful and less useful is just to think in terms of whether they are naturally occurring fats. So fats that come in foods generally quite naturally, like avocado, eggs, some dairy products, they're generally quite filling. And we know from an old study called the satiety index that these natural fats are much better at keeping us full. And they often come combined with a bit of protein, which doesn't help. So they keep us quite full, whereas added fats, when we fry food or we put vegetable oil into cheap, hyper-palatable food, tend to make us overeat a lot. So when we're going for fat in our diet, we want to add natural fats that commonly occur in kind of unprocessed foods. The fourth of our filling food groups is juicy fruit. And fruit seems to get a bad rap these days, which it really doesn't deserve. People have kind of lumped it in with just processed sugar, which is not a sensible way to think about things. Juicy fruit, particularly low caloric density, that's why I say juicy rather than general fruit, tends to fill up liver glycogen, which sends a fullness signal to the brain. So it can actually be quite useful. And when you go for the juicier fruits, so your berries, citrus, apples, these types of things, you can actually eat quite a lot of them, and they can help you to lose weight. And they can also kind of satisfy some of that sweet tooth that a lot of us have. There's an old study, a paleo study, in fact, that showed that people were putting away over a pound of fruit a day, and yet they were losing weight like you wouldn't believe. So don't let people tell you that you can't eat fruit. Just gravitate to more the juicier ones. So the berries, the oranges, the citrus, these types of things are really useful. The last of our filling food groups is watery carbs. And these are foods that you classically think of as carbs, but have a lot of water content. So I'm talking about rice, oatmeal, pasta, potatoes. Foods that have a lot of water and fiber in them tend to be quite full. We know this from the satiety index that actually carbohydrates can be surprisingly full. And these days, people are kind of brainwashed against carbohydrates like they used to be against fat. And it is kind of nonsense. We know that there is no metabolic advantage between low fat or low carb diets. It's just that sometimes low carb diets can tend to be a little bit more filling. But you don't want to throw out all your carbs. And the best way to think about your carb intake, for me personally, is like an athlete. So basically, people who do kind of endurance sports can get away with eating a heap of these watery types of carbs because their activity level is quite high. Whereas if you've got a lower activity level, someone who's like a weightlifter or something like that, they tend to not eat as many carbohydrates because they're simply not doing the type of volume in terms of burning oxygen. So it's very, very simple. My favorite framework is just one from the US Olympic Committee, which basically shows that the size of this chunk of carbs on the plate should really vary between a training day and a rest day. And I think that's really the smart way to think about these kind of watery carbs. So basically, if you've just done some exercise, it's a perfect time to eat a good number of carbohydrates. It refill glycogen, you can enjoy your food, and there's just no possible way for it to contribute to adiposity, for gaining fat. So basically, yeah, watery carbs, think of them as around activity. They're super useful if you're doing a lot of activity, but if you're not doing a lot of activity and just sitting there in your desk, then they are the one that you want to restrict at that time period, and then you can have more of them when you are doing a lot of exercise. Okay, just wrapping up, I'm going to put these 5 food groups into what I call the filling food plate. So this is our lean protein, colorful vegetables, natural fats, juicy fruit, and watery carbs. So what we do is we start with this is really good for just lunch and dinner. Don't worry too much about breakfast, but a palmful of protein up in one corner, and then half the plate, so a big cupful of colorful veggies, or if you would like, some juicy fruit. You can switch those two out here because they're both pretty low in caloric density. Then we add a thumbful of natural fat, or even 2 thumbs. Basically, that's your avocado or some dairy, a bit of cheese, some eggs, some seeds. And then finally, the watery carb, this is the one that you're going to vary based on activity. So that is, I like to go with a fist, and if I've done lots of exercise, I'll have more. I tend to not take it away completely, that's just me, but some people can completely ditch the watery carbs if they want on certain meals. And that is a way of wrapping all the science into a simple plate of food. It's great for lunch and dinner. If you don't want to track and you're just on the run, it is absolutely perfect. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you jump on the email list and get our 5 simple strategies to start losing weight cheat sheet.